Well, up to this point, we've been going through preliminary remarks to the theoretical exposition of the Austrian theory. And in this lecture, we'll begin that process of giving a overview, a description of how the Austrian theory is developed and in some instances how it differs importantly from other approaches. So we begin by saying that economics is a study of human action. It's certainly not the only discipline that studies human action, but it has its own niche in the liberal arts. As we've already spoken about, human action is defined simply as purposeful behavior, that action is directed toward the attainment of an end, and that the attainment of the end is the motive behind the action. Quite obviously, having an end is not sufficient for acting. All of us have unfulfilled ends at any point in time. So it must be necessary for action that we control the use of means in acting, that we have what we might call economic ownership over means when we engage in action. And finally, we also must be able to formulate in our minds ideas about the application of means to the attainment of ends. We must have some ideas about how means can be used to attain ends, even if these ideas are faulty. Now, with that definition in hand, we can go directly to the beginning point of Austrian thought, which is called the Axiom of Action. This is simply the proposition that individuals act. This is where all of our knowledge of economics begins. We know the truth of this axiom reflectively, as we know through our own experience what it means to act. We know that we've had ends that we've striven to attain. We know that we've used means and formulated ideas in these actions in the past. And all of our understanding of economics comes then from this reflective knowledge, from the fact that we are human beings who engage in action. Lesser beings could never develop economics. They could not comprehend economic thought. We also know that this axiom is true by a logical proof. Any attempt to disprove the proposition that individuals act is in fact an action that has the end of attempting to prove the proposition false. It must employ means. Ideas must be in mind by the person attempting this refutation. This gives us then the possibility of engaging in an axiomatic deductive science, the science of praxeology, where we begin with this axiom that individuals act, understanding that this also encompasses all of the reflective knowledge that we have in our minds about what acting is. And then we simply draw out the implications or the logical conclusions that are implied by the fact of acting and by this knowledge that we have through our own experience of acting. Now, in addition to this logical process of beginning with axioms and engaging in deduction, praxeology employs what Mises called imaginary constructions. And there are two important ways in which this technique of thinking is used in Austrian economics. One is to construct simplifying situations of acting. You've already heard one of these, Robinson Crusoe, the isolated individual, the household economy, whatever we wish to call this, where we abstract away from the complexities of social interaction. There's no money, there's no division of labor, there's no exchange. There's just Crusoe directly acting with nature-given means. This has certain advantages when we're exploring various basic principles of economics, like the law of diminishing marginal utility, as Professor Salerno has already explained. The second way in which imaginary constructions are used is to engage in what-if thought experiments. So here we look at a real situation of acting, and then we ask the question, what if the conditions of acting in this real situation in all of its complexity. We're slightly different. The most common use of this technique is in the laws of supply and demand, which we'll talk about in the course of this lecture. So when we talk about the laws of supply and demand, we say something like this. When I was coming on my trip to Auburn from Grove City, I filled my car up with gas before I drove to the airport. I bought $15 worth of gas. The price was $1.29.9 a gallon. So here's a real situation of acting in all of its complexity. The subjective values that I had in my mind, the money that I had, the purposes that I intend, the means that I'm using, and so on. And if we wish to construct out of this situation of acting the law of demand, we would simply say, what if the price, instead of being $1.29.9, was $1.25? What if the price were different from what it actually was? Is there anything in the logic of action which would necessitate a particular behavior on my part? And if so, what is this? Furthermore, at the very beginning, we know that since our axiom is true, that individuals act, and since action is defined as applying means according to ideas to attain ends, that is, it has three basic conceptual parts to it, that each one of these parts must be in place for action to occur. An individual must have an end in his mind, otherwise no action could ever occur. In economic theory, this end is treated in a content-neutral way. That is to say, we can't deduce from the proposition that individuals act, that individuals have particular concrete ends. I want to take a trip to Auburn, or that you want to come here and study, and so on and so forth. But only that the actor must have some end. He must have an end in his mind. So economics, as the Austrians view it, does not necessitate any kind of psychological assumptions, what the particular motivations are, the particular concrete ends. It doesn't necessitate any kind of ethical assumptions about ends, whether the ends are good or bad, moral, immoral, and so on and so forth. We also saw that means are necessary, or the ownership of means is necessary for action to occur. I referred to this as economic ownership. I just say that this is de facto ownership. Whatever the items the individual actually controls in his action, he owns economically. And that no action can take place without such, we might call it personal ownership. Clearly, we don't begin in economic thought with any concept of political ownership, legal rights, let's say, to property. These are not necessary for us to spin out economic thought. We begin only with this concept of personal ownership. And finally, about ideas, Professor Salerno mentioned that ideas in action can be faulty. We can drink arsenic when we think we're drinking water and kill ourselves. But in economics, we know, in economic thought, we know that action presupposes that the individual has some notion about how to combine means to attain ends. Otherwise, no action at all could be forthcoming. So economics isn't about technology. It isn't about the recipes of combining means to attain ends. It isn't about whether these recipes are more or less suited to the attainment of ends. In other words, it isn't about efficiency. It's simply about the fact that ideas are employed in action. Now, as Professor Hoppe mentioned last night, there are then, in this structure of thinking about the beginnings of economics, there are two branches to economics, two studies. One is economic theory. Economic theory then just accepts the axiom as true and spins out by logic the economic laws that are implied in it. And then there's economic history. Economic history uses the laws of economics and laws of other disciplines, or other principles of other disciplines, like psychology and technology and ethics and so on, to come to specific understanding And as Mises conceives it, specific understanding is the understanding that a person has of precisely of the concrete actions of individuals. This is necessary to do history. As we look back upon actions, we want to understand the motive of the actor, the circumstance in which he took the action, the values and the costs that he perceived in acting in one way versus another. And it's also the basis for engaging in entrepreneurial foresight. To the entrepreneur has to make some judgment as to the consumer's demands, what they're based on, how to motivate the consumer to buy his product and not his competitors, etc. This is the realm of economic history, or the realm of specific understanding. Okay, now to begin with the topic proper of value in economics, we might first point out that in economic theory there are two different concepts that have to be kept in mind when we talk about valuation. One, Professor Salerno has already discussed, and we'll go through this in some additional detail. This is the process that Mises calls valuation. Valuation is simply the establishment in a person's mind who's acting of a preference between one option and another. And of course, all action then is based upon valuation. This is the inherent in every action that any person takes. But in addition to valuation, there's also the concept of what Mises calls appraisement. And appraisement is the principles of valuation applied to the social setting. So when we wish to talk about how in society as a group we arrange the division of labor to best satisfy our wants, that is to give goods produced that we value most highly, and to produce each good with the least sacrifice of factors of production, we cannot appeal to valuation. Again, we'll talk about this in detail in a minute. We must have cardinal numbers to engage in this kind of assessment or judgment of value. This cannot be done with ordinal ranks or subjective valuations in the minds of individuals. So we have these two concepts, and in the main what we need to show is how they're reconciled. What's the relationship between valuation and appraisement? What's the relationship between the value scales that we have in our minds when we act and the result of allocation of the factors of production in the division of labor? How does this come about? And we'll see that the answer to this is much different in the Austrian tradition than it is in the mainstream literature in economics. Now, first of all, we can dismiss out of hand one option. One option would be, and even neoclassical economists by and large dismiss this, one option would be that we just imagine a collective acting entity. Imagine something what Benjamin Anderson called the social mind. And the social mind ranks these things for us. It gives us a social ranking, just like an individual mind would for individual action. Clearly, this is not permissible within the realm of praxeology. We realize immediately upon thinking about it that not only do individuals act, this is our basic premise, but only individuals act. There are no other acting entities, right? There are no collective acting agents. Whatever our explanation is of the relationship between individual action based upon ordinal ranks of value and social action based upon cardinal numbers, we cannot appeal to a collective entity and stay within the realm of praxeology. This would violate our basic premise. Now to go through in a little bit more detail about valuation, and then we'll see how appraisement follows from it. We know in action that all means are scarce. This is not this is not a proposition that we notice empirically, although we do notice it empirically. It's not one that's proven empirically, I should say. It simply comes from the very fact that we act. If we act, by necessity, there must be ends that we have not yet fulfilled. If we had fulfilled all of our ends, then we would not act, right? There would be nothing else that we could envision acting towards to attain. That would be a condition where means were abundant to us. So we know that all means are scarce. We know that there can be no such thing as a post-scarcity situation. We could never usefully invent such a condition or use it in economics. We know furthermore that if means are scarce and yet we act in the face of scarcity, we must be able to choose between competing ends. We must be able to say, okay, I'll use my scarce means to attain this end, but I must simultaneously then set aside the pursuit of another end. So we get the principle of allocation, of choosing how to use our means to attain some ends and not others. Obviously, all choices are two-dimensional. We choose what we prefer, and we set aside what we prefer less. All action then involves value, the value of what we aim at, and the cost of our action, the value of what we forego. Allocation in human action must be done by evaluation, as we said before. This is in keeping with the notion of purposefulness. There's no such thing as a purposeless action, and therefore all action is based upon what we value. And as I mentioned previously, this value, theoretically, when we say that we choose what we prefer and we set aside what we prefer less, this valuation only implies an ordinal rank. Only that one thing is better and another is not as good. That's all that's logically necessary for us to choose. We don't need to know by how much one option is more valuable than another. We simply need to have a preference. This preference is just between two options, as I mentioned before. The preference scale, for example, that Professor Salerno was using before, is something of an imaginary construction. In every action, we always act on the margin. We always act with the particular conditions in which we find ourselves. We have, like boehm-bawerk's 5 sacks of flour. We have 5 sacks of flour, and we act given that condition. And therefore, we're always acting with the value of the marginal unit. We're always establishing a preference between one option and another. In other words, we don't have in our minds enacting a preference map that maps out all the possible options of acting. We just say, this is one option, this is my next best option, I choose what I prefer, and this is how I engage in action. This is what is meant by valuation. These preferences that are involved in our action are existent in our minds at the time that we act. They're coincident with acting. Once again, if you study economics, you know that isn't the way in which preference or utility is conceived in the mainstream. In the neoclassical economics, utility is conceived as a utility function or an indifference map that exists independent of action. That is to say, our minds are capable of constructing this indifference map solely on the basis of speculative meanderings in our mind, separated from action. But this clearly, again, if we separate utility from action, we don't have a theory of action at all. We have something else, a theory of utility, a psychological theory of human behavior or something of this sort. If our deductions about economics are to be grounded in the premise or the axiom that individuals act, whatever we say about valuation must be in action. It must be relevant to action. And so preferences are always in the action itself and not somehow outside the action, imposing themselves somehow on action. This is where we get to Professor Rothbard's principle of demonstrated preference. That when we engage in an action, we demonstrate that we prefer one option to another. I buy the gasoline before I come on my trip, and I demonstrate in that action that I prefer the gas to the money. The owner of the gas station demonstrates his reverse ordering of preference. Aside from this, we know nothing whatsoever about people's preferences. Again, remembering we use the term in Austrian Economics preference to refer to action. not to musings about what we might do hypothetically. So given that, of course, we know nothing whatsoever about a person's preference save what we see them do in action. Now let's deal with this principle you've heard mentioned of subjective value. We note in economics that value is fundamentally subjective. We might say primarily subjective. It's first and foremost subjective. This does not mean, of course, that we're denying in economics that there can be such a thing as objective value. Of course, there can be objective value. That's what prices are. Prices are objective in the scientific sense of being measurable. But prices are not primary. Prices are the effect, the cause being subjective value. So what we mean by subjective value, first and foremost, is that value exists in our mind. It's a product of the mind. It's an intensive state of mind, to put it differently. Because subjective value then is wholly a product of our mind, it has no extensive property, and lacking an extensive property, it cannot be measured. That is to say, we can't come up with something like a unit of subjective value. If I enjoy a chocolate ice cream, and I say that a bowl of chocolate ice cream gives me 10 utils of satisfaction, this is an entirely meaningless statement. This has no scientific merit to say something like this. Because in order for someone to know what 10 utils of satisfaction is, the person must know what 1 util is. And this is the very problem, right? You cannot know what a util of satisfaction is to me. It's because my subjective value doesn't have an extensive property that you can objectively measure. So without any units of subjective value, we're denied being able to apply directly the notion of cardinal measurement to utility. And in fact, economists have long recognized this after some flirtation with the idea of cardinal utility, which I might just point out was a product of the desire of economists around the turn of the century to construct welfare theory. To be able to say something like, well, if we take $10,000 from David Rockefeller and we give it to David Gordon, Rockefeller being very rich and David Gordon being very poor, this will increase social utility, will lower the utility of Rockefeller much less than will raise the utility of Gordon. And we can somehow measure the shift in utility between the two individuals. So cardinal utility quickly came to a well-deserved end, a well-deserved demise. And when it was recognized by Lionel Robbins and others that there can be no interpersonal comparisons of utility. This is precisely the point that we're making. Value is subjective, and lacking a cardinal unit where objective measurement can be done, there can be no comparisons of utility among individuals. Now, of course, this didn't stop the drive to do welfare theory. Welfare theory then shifted to coming up with a cardinal proxy for utility. And obviously, the obvious proxy to use would be money. And now you'll notice we get in economics then the first attempt to grapple with this question of how the subjective values, which are ordinal ranks in the minds of individuals, produce cardinal numbers, which are prices. So one argument would be, well, they just directly do this. We can, in other words, we can just assign a monetary value to the utility that we acquire from each action we take. And so we have something like a cardinal proxy for utility. Again, the problem with this is quite obvious. The problem is there's no such thing as an equality between a sum of money in cardinal units and an ordinal rank of utility. We'll get to this in more detail later when we talk about the principle of indifference. But right now it should seem implausible to you that such a thing could be. Right? It doesn't seem How can this be the case? If in action everything is always a preference, one thing is better, another is worse, then there's no room for something like these two options have the exact same utility. Okay, now before we go to indifference, so let me finish up with subjective value. There was then a drive in economics, which is still quite alive, to come up with something like a direct quantitative representation of utility. Now, if we can't use a proxy like money, let's just use a utility function. Now, as I mentioned before, the basic problem with this, if one wishes to apply it in a direct sort of fashion, is precisely this problem that there are no units of subjective value. No units of subjective value, you obviously cannot establish functions between units of subjective value which don't exist and units of goods which do. Saying, I get my 10 utils of satisfaction from consuming a bowl of chocolate ice cream. Another problem with this attempt to give mathematical formulation to a utility is that there are no constants in action. There's nothing that we can deduce, and in fact our empirical experience with action seems to verify that our behavior is not constant. Our preference rankings change. And so we like one thing at one time, but we don't like it later. We change our mind about the value of gasoline as soon as we buy it. The marginal utility of it goes down. So our preferences are always shifting. There's nothing predictable or constant in them. But if there's nothing constant in them, then we can't usefully employ functional representations. Functional representations rely upon constants. Right? We write out a formula and we say, my utility is x times y, or my utility is 4x plus 2y, or something like this. There are constants in every function. That's what gives it its functional form. As opposed to just saying, as Professor Salerno did before, that output is a function of inputs without specifying the functional form. So, without constancy, then all we can say about mathematical formulation is that if one wishes to formulate a mathematical equation of utility, it could exist only in a useful fashion. It could exist only at a moment in time when a person's preferences are constant. But over time, it could never be applied. Right? We can't presuppose that they're constants. Now, let me turn to more specifically to this question of trying to come up with a quantitative representation of ordinal ranks. Let's say that I have 3 students in a class and I give them grades of A, B, and C. And grading is an ordinal ranking, right? All I have here are ordinal ranks. A is better, B is not as good, C is not as good as B. And now I wish to do something like this. I wish to say, well, even though all I have are ordinal ranks, I can arbitrarily assign cardinal numbers to this ordinal rank that permit me to represent the rank. So I'm not saying in this argument that there is utility. I'm just saying, why don't I just assign numbers arbitrarily? Let's say I'll just call the A 95, I'll call the B 85, I'll call the C 75. And once I've done this, I just use the cardinal representation of the ordinal ranks to engage in mathematical analyses. Now, the problem with this approach from the Austrian view is quite apparent. And in fact, the literature went through this in the early part of the 20th century. This discussion was undertaken. The problem with this is that by assigning a series of cardinal numbers to these ordinal ranks, I add something to the ordinal ranks that didn't exist before. Right? I'm saying with my cardinal numbers, my 95, 85, 75, I'm saying something more than, or perhaps it's something less than, but something different than just the ordinal rank itself. What I'm adding to the ordinal rank is the quantitative difference between the rank orders. Right? Now I'm saying that a C is exactly 10 units less than a B, and a B is exactly 10 units less than an A. That's not in the concept of ordinal rank. Just by saying A, B, C, I don't know what the quantitative difference is between an A and a B and a B and a C. I've added a condition here. And of course, that's precisely what those who wish to use quantitative representation want. They want to add this kind of proportionality so that they can manipulate it mathematically. Now, the response to this criticism of using cardinal numbers was this. Well, if all you're saying then is that the gap between these different numbers is arbitrary, let's just do with the numbers a transformation. Let's just do monotonic transformations. Right? Let's just multiply all those numbers by 2. Or let's cut all the numbers in half. Now by doing that, of course, I don't change the proportional structure of my original cardinal rank, right? I still have the same proportional relationship between each series of numbers. But I've cut the size of the gap. Well, I've increased it here and then cut it here, right? So I can make the gap. This is completely arbitrary to say that the gap size is determined by or imposed upon the ordinal rank by these cardinal numbers. We'll just do monotonic transformations. Okay? This is our way out. So one function can represent all monotonic transformations, right? It's a very simple, seemingly elegant solution. The problem with this is, again, rather apparent once you see it. The problem is that this single monotonic transformation, this single function that we're transforming in by multiplying or dividing, represents only one possible original set of cardinal numbers that match this ordinal rank. So the problem is this. If I have the ordinal rank and I say I start with 95, 85, 75, I do all these monotonic transformations, and the relationship, the proportional relationship between the numbers always stays the same. But why is that a condition of the ordinal rank? Why, in other words, can't I also have as an option this pattern? That too would be ABC, right? And notice none of these monotonic transformations are equivalent to this. Or I could do another one. Right? I can do innumerable cardinal rank orders to begin with that all fit my ordinal rank of ABC. And none of these are monotonic transformations of this. So, as I mentioned, this effort to engage in quantitative representation of ordinal ranks is inconsistent with the notion of ordinal rank as conceived of in the Austrian thought. Now, I won't take the time to show this, simply because I don't have the time, but let me just mention how this works out, like how you could apply this problem that we've seen to the way in which demand theory is constructed. So here, the problem would be this. We know that in demand theory, demand is mapped out by shifting the budget constraint. We change the price of the good, and we map out along a set of indifference curves. We say lower prices, and we get a new optimization point and greater quantity purchase of lower prices. And in each case, then we find the optimal point by a tangency. The marginal rate of substitution of the two goods is equal to the price ratio. Okay. I'm assuming that all of you have seen this. But what this necessitates, if one wishes to map out a demand relationship in this mathematical way, is that the marginal rate of substitution in the function is unique for each price structure. You don't get multiple optimization points, okay, or at least not inconsistent optimizational points. So for each price ratio of x to y, each budget line, it is tangent to one indifference curve only at one place. However, if one, and that's fine if one assumes that one can construct a single unique utility function that represents an ordinal rank. But what if you can't? What if, in other words, there isn't one indifference map that's spun out by one utility function, but there are innumerable utility functions, each of which spins out a indifference map, which is what I'm suggesting in this analysis. Well, then you would have several marginal rates of substitution consistent with the same price ratio, and you would not be able to say which is optimal. You would not be able to choose one or the other. You could not say, to go back to this example, you could not say that 89 was better or worse than 85. They're the same ordinal rank. Right? Again, if you're interested in that, I can show you the mathematics of it. Now let's get to indifference curves per se and a few comments about that attempt. And first of all, let me just put up a preference rank as we might envision it in the Austrian manner. And someone buying a good at various prices or sums of money. And so the preference rank would look like this. Let's say $100 would be a price too high. The person would not pay $100 to buy this unit of X. But if the price happened to be 90, he would. So he goes into the store, the price is 100 for this jacket or whatever it is, and he doesn't buy it. But if he were to go into the store and the price were 90, he would buy it. So this is what we mean by a preference rank. Notice it's money, it's sums of money against units of the good. This is how our buying takes place, right? We go into a grocery store and it's a loaf of bread, and I establish a preference between the loaf of bread and sums of money. That's how we act. This is valuation. Well, how is this done with a utility function? How is this done with indifference analysis? With indifference curves, we do something like this. We don't rank money against goods. We rank bundles of goods, right? Say we rank the bundle 2x, 1y. And we say that's worth more than the bundle 1x, 1y, which is worth more than the bundle that doesn't have any x but has 1y. And then from this indifference map, which we presumably, if we were talking about real human beings, we would have to construct in our minds, sort of in an arbitrary fashion, a speculative fashion. We then impose monetary constraints with the budget constraint. So indifference analysis bifurcates the actual process by which we choose. Right? It says there's a utility part of it, there's a monetary part of it, and then we somehow bring the two together. Utility is not, in other words, something that's to be seen as regulating the whole process of choice, as we do in the Austrian view. We say we compare the utility of $100 to the utility of the unit. We directly compare money to the good. With indifference analysis, we never do that. We just say, here are the various utilities I have of all the goods, and then the budget constraint leads me to choose one particular bundle of goods that I find most valuable given my monetary constraints. Again, this seems completely artificial, if not just wrong on the face of it. Furthermore, we might point out that indifference is, of course, a psychological principle, at least as we see it in Austrian economics. It is not a principle of acting. It's a principle of non-action. If we're indifferent between two options, we do not choose between them. If we do not choose between them, we do not act towards them. So we don't get action from indifference, we only get non-acting. So indifference cannot be a praxeological concept, a useful praxeological concept. It's a concept of obvious use in psychology, where intensity of preference is of interest to us. We also might note that indifference, of course, was established in the economic literature to precisely avoid the problem of cardinal utility. We don't want to say that there's cardinal utility. How do we get around it? We get around it by the principle of indifference. We say that We have an indifference map. All the ranks are ordinal. Okay, we say we can prefer one option to another, or we're indifferent between them. And apparently we have no cardinal utility here. But that's not exactly correct. If we say that we're indifferent between two options, it's pretty easy to assume that this really means that the utility of the two options is the same. And of course, that's precisely what happens when you see this theory spun out before you in the form of utility functions. Right? We're writing out utility functions, then we must be working with cardinal numbers. We must be saying, in other words, that indifference simply means that utility of one option or bundle is equal to the utility of another. And so it's just a way to introduce cardinal utility through the back door. It's been pointed out in several places that, of course, indifference, the very principle of indifference, does not imply continuity. Indifference just means I can rank a bunch of options, and these options, among some of them I'm indifferent, and among others I have a preference. But in order to have the principle of continuity and then tangencies, nice smooth indifference curves and tangency points, and thus solutions in demand analysis, one has to add something else. Something more than just the principle of indifference. One must add some other condition. And this other condition seems necessarily, even if indifference doesn't, to imply cardinal utility. In fact, it seems to imply even something beyond cardinal units of utility. It seems to imply infinitesimal cardinal units of utility, which is, again, sort of a step even further into the abyss. Even at best, indifference curve analysis requires that all possible options are ranked. Okay? You have to be able to do this in order to establish the indifference map. But of course, no human person could ever do this. Right? This is not the way we act. Only if you're willing to surrender real flesh and blood human actors and say that economic theory is really just about economic agents, fictitious economic agents. Can you make this analysis work? And we might also notice that indifference curves themselves, for those of you who've gone through the construction of indifference curves, I won't do that, but for those of you who are familiar with this, know that the construction of the indifference curves is dependent upon a transitivity assumption of preferences. If A is preferred to B, B is preferred to C, then A has to be preferred to C. Otherwise, you don't get non-intersecting indifference curves and so on. But actually, indifference curves, again, require another condition beyond transitivity. And this condition is a constancy. Now, once again, there are various options here, but in the standard way in which indifference curve analysis is used, which is to deduce a demand curve that is empirically testable, in order to deduce this demand curve, we start at point A at this price, and then we say, well, next week the price is lower, and we buy more, and the next week the price is even lower, and we buy even more. Then we must presuppose that our indifference map stays constant over the time when demand is being mapped out, when our preferences are being revealed over time empirically. But again, it seems to contradict the experience that we have of our own acting and the acting of other people that we observe, that preferences are not constant. And then finally, we might just point out that indifference curves perhaps cannot be, or at least never are, used to derive supply curves. Indifference curves are only used for demand. And so in standard economics, we have consumer behavior theory, which is based upon indifference curves and budget constraints. And then we have supply, the theory of supply, which is based upon cost of production. It's based upon isoquants and isocosts. It invokes various assumptions which are outside of the general principle of valuation in acting, which is, for example, that businessmen don't maximize utility, right? Businessmen maximize profit. We as factor owners of factors of production, we don't maximize utility, we maximize income. And so we become, we add again what we might call a psychological assumption here. Or, to look at this in an alternative way, we no longer have a general theory of economics, a general theory of behavior. We have consumers who act to maximize utility. We have businessmen who act differently. All they want to do is maximize monetary profit. And the same people who are consumers maximizing utility when they buy goods are trying to maximize their income when they sell their factors. But as we've already pointed out in the Austrian view, all action is predicated upon the same basis, which is preference, subjective value. This is true of the businessman, it's true of you and I as factor owners. We don't always try to take the job with the highest monetary income. We take the job we prefer. So it's a rather convenient fact that indifference analysis is not easily useful for deriving supply, which then leaves a huge gap. What will we say about supply that can be filled with a different theory? Now, as we pointed out before, though, cost in action is fundamentally subjective. Cost is simply the value of the foregone option. So it's quite obvious that it's a very simple matter to construct an opportunity cost theory of supply. That supply is no different from demand in its causal explanation, at least. Now, we also notice in going back to the deduction about economic principles here in the Austrian view, that if in choice we aim our action at what we value more and we set aside an alternative that we value less, it must be the case that there's net benefit in every action. There's at least anticipated net benefit. And in economics we call this profit. Profit is just the difference between the value of what we obtain by acting and the cost that we forego. So we might then just say that all action of all people is aimed at earning psychic profit. This is the sense in which there's a profit motive in acting. The subjective value difference between what we attain and what we surrender in acting. We might also add, of course, that there are two ways of calculating profit, of looking at profit. One is looking to the future. This is entrepreneurial profit. This is the most important, in theoretical sense, the most important for acting, where we know that before we act, before we actually apply the means to a particular action, we must simply have some expectation about what the result will be, what the value will be of the action we attain, what the costs are incurred from surrendering something else. So entrepreneurial profit before we act is always speculative. But we can also calculate profit looking ex post. After the action takes place, we can look back upon the action and we can see whether or not we realized profit, whether the action really turned out as a net benefit or whether the value was less than the cost. So we can do accounting, which is looking back to the past, and we can do entrepreneurial profit calculations. This again, just to reiterate, is involved in every action. Every time we act, this is what we do, even though we don't call it this. Now the word Ludwig von Mises likes to use here is economizing. That all action is economizing. And by this he means that action always aims at the greatest psychic profit. That in action we always try to achieve the highest valued end with a given means. Or, alternatively, we could say it this way, that for every end we seek to attain it with the least valued set of means. Where all of these valuations are subjective. In our own mind, our assessment of these values. We also saw from Professor Salerno's lecture that value is imputed in action. the value, when we look at the relationship between the value in our mind and means, the value logically begins in our mind. This is the subjective value, and then is imputed to the value of goods that aid in the satisfaction of our ends. And even though we won't, we'll look at this step in a little bit more detail in a minute, but even though we won't look at the final step, we can also show later in the week that the value of the consumer goods is then imputed to the factors of production. So this is the way in which, as Professor Salerno pointed out, Menger conceived of the causal relationship between value. So the value in our mind causes the prices of consumer goods, which then cause the prices of the factors of production. Notice if we were to turn this causal direction around, if we were to say well, the value of the factors comes first and then is imputed to the value of the consumer goods and then to our mind, we would have the cost of production theory of value or a labor theory of value. So this step, instead of being entrepreneurial competition for the factors, this step would be production, right? So factors have inherent value, intrinsic value, and by production, this value gets imputed to the consumer good, and then by some other magical process, I suppose, that our minds recognize this value, recognize the value of the consumer goods as being proper or correct. And then if we were to turn, just to use this schematic to look at the Marshallian approach, the Marshallian approach isn't a causal argument at all, right? Consumer goods prices are mutually determined. There's an arrow running this way from consumer demand, from our minds, and an arrow running this way from cost of production. So we put the two factors together and say there's no such thing as causation or causal laws in economics. Their prices are mutually determined. Okay, now let's go on to appraisement. As I mentioned before, the problem of appraisement is that valuation, which is ordinal ranking of different options, is insufficient to economize action in a division of labor. And there are two problems here. One is that, remember, economizing is striving to attain the highest valued ends with the least valued means. And so the problem is twofold. We can neither decide what the highest valued ends are by valuation in society, nor can we decide what the least valued set of means happens to be. The problem with the consumer goods, trying to determine what the most valued set of goods is precisely the problem we mentioned before of ordinal ranks. I like chocolate ice cream more than vanilla, you like vanilla more than chocolate, and we simply can't decide whose preferences outweigh the other person's on the basis of simply those statements. These ordinal ranks, right? This is no grounds on which such a thing could be done. And contrary to Louis XIV, the Sun King, he can't do it either, right? No dictator, no central planner can in his own mind make these rankings. There's no such thing as a process of social ordinal ranks. There's no collective mind. There's no possibility that any person, even an objective person, could make such a rank order. The problem on the cost side and the use of the factors of production is slightly different. The problem in the uses of the factors of production is we have a division of labor economy. Appraisement is useful only in the division of labor. A division of labor economy means that not all people do all things. Right? Some people are carpenters, others are teachers, others are brain surgeons, and so on and so forth. There's specialization according to the principle of comparative advantage of the various factors. Now this means, of course, that the cost involved in doing each of these particular tasks across the division of labor can be experienced only by the person who does them. Only the teacher can know what the opportunity cost of teaching is. Only the brain surgeon can know what the opportunity cost of brain surgery is. The teacher cannot know that, right? In order for one person to assess the opportunity cost by valuation, by his own personal ranking of the value of the options foregone, he would have to do all jobs. But that's precisely what the division of labor is not. The division of labor is specialization. It's simply impossible then for there to be any valuation of across the division of labor by one person who's able to do this ranking process. So we're stuck with this difficulty. The way in which this is solved, according to the Austrians, is that these preferences in our minds are acted upon in the market through demand and supply, which leads to prices. The ordinal ranks are made into cardinal numbers. They result in cardinal numbers through the actions of demand and supply. Now, we don't, unfortunately, have time to go through this, the precise demonstration of this, but at least not in any detail, but I'll try to give you a summary of this. Professor Salerno mentioned the principle of the law of diminishing marginal utility. This law, of course, operates in every action, including buying and selling things. So it's quite obvious from this law that if we do a what-if thought experiment about buying things, we arrive at the law of demand. So I gave you my example before of buying gasoline. I bought 15 gallons of gasoline at $1.29 a gallon. We can ask this question: what if the price would have been lower? Well, if the price would have been lower, then it would have been logically possible for me to have bought more gasoline. On the other hand, at a higher price, it would be logically impossible for me to have purchased more gasoline. Why is this so? Because the additional units of gas must necessarily be worth less to me, and therefore I'm willing to pay less. So we get directly from the principle of diminishing marginal utility, well, in the second law of utility, which is more is preferred to less. More money is preferred to less money, or more of a good is preferred to less. We get the principle of the law of demand. We can, of course, then do the same thing with supply. If I have gasoline to sell, then the cost to me of selling the gasoline is the foregone alternative use. Since I rank these uses in order of importance to me, as I sell more of my gasoline, the marginal utility of the gas is higher. Therefore, in order to sell more, or to sell a larger volume and give up these higher valued uses, I have to have a higher price. And we get the law of supply. Now, the law of demand and the law of supply in the Austrian vision of things are different from the standard approach. As I mentioned earlier, the neoclassical approach is to treat demand and supply as empirical propositions. That over time, at lower prices, demand would be greater, prices were lower, and supply larger, prices were higher. The Austrian view, as I mentioned already, of demand and supply is demand and supply are what-if thought experiments. They're conjectures about what would occur if conditions were different than what they really were. And it's in this sense that the laws of supply and demand permit us to have a theory of price determination. So we see when I buy gas that the price is $1.29. And we can, through conjecture, knowing the laws of supply and demand, easily explain why the price was neither lower nor higher than it actually was. We can explain, so to speak, what the nature of the conditions are that determine that price. Now, clearly the price could not be lower than $1.29, because if it were, there would be excess demand, right? Demanders would want more, suppliers would supply less. There would be a condition of excess demand. Why can't there be conditions of excess demand in the market? Well, there can't be conditions of excess demand in the market for various reasons. One, if I'm a demander and I wish to buy the good, I'm certainly willing to pay the price, and yet I'm cut out of the market because of excess demand. Some of the buyers can't buy what they want. I won't take this lying down, right? I'll bid a higher price. So there's competition among the buyers that keeps the price from being below the market clearing level. And in a similar way, competition from the sellers that keeps it from being above the market clearing level. If the price were above $1.29, it would imply excess supply. But no seller will put up with excess supply, or at least not all sellers will. The more eager sellers will bid the price down. But then, because of the law of marginal utility valuation of goods, since all units of the good have to be priced the same, this means all competitors follow. And so we get a market clearing price, the price of the good where demand and supply are the same. Now, once again, let me conclude here by reiterating what the nature of this price is. In the Austrian view, this price is the actual existing price of a good in the market. The actual price of the gas at the gas station, the actual price of bread in the grocery store, the actual price of cars in the car dealerships. We're not talking in Austrian theory, at this point at least, about equilibrium prices, about what prices would be if conditions were, let's say, hypothetically different from what they were in some entirely problematic way, like the ERE, where there's no change and etc. Now we're talking just about the actual existing prices of goods and factors of production. Now, why is it necessary to have a theory of the price of actual goods? A theory of actual prices of goods? Well, because these are the prices that exist. These are the prices upon which entrepreneurs make their judgments about the valuation, their appraisements, I should say, about the division of labor, about allocating factors and trying to produce goods that consumers demand. It isn't equilibrium prices that they're predicting. It's actual future prices. And these actual future prices can be appraised on the basis of existing actual prices, but not on the basis of hypothetical equilibrium prices. And so in the Austrian view, it's extremely important. In fact, this is the first primary function of price theory, is to give an explanation of actual prices of goods. Okay, I'll stop here.